The grass was wet beneath Arabella's bare feet when she found the child standing on the ducal lawn at midnight. A small figure in a white nightgown, holding a folded piece of paper against her chest. The child looked up at her without fear, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, and asked in a voice so steady it made Arabella's breath catch, "Is 63 rooms enough for me?" Arabella knelt slowly, her dressing gown soaking through at the knees, and reached out one hand without touching. "Are you lost?" she asked. But the child shook her head and said, "I am not lost. I came to see." Then Julian appeared on the gravel path, his coat unbuttoned and his face pale in the moonlight. And Arabella understood with a clarity that made her chest tighten that she had been asking the wrong question for 3 years. Arabella had smelled lavender on Julian's collar every morning for 3 years. Not the English lavender she grew in the kitchen garden, something sharper, wilder, with a note of resin underneath. She had noticed it first in the 2nd month of their marriage, when he kissed her goodbye in the bedchamber and she caught the scent as he straightened. She had asked him once, early on, where he walked in the mornings. He had told her the birch path, the one that ran east from the estate toward the old tenant cottages. He had told her it was treacherous in winter, overgrown in summer, and dangerous in autumn when the leaves turned slick. He had told her this in 4 separate seasons, and she had believed him every time. The child on the lawn was barefoot. Her feet left small prints in the wet grass, darker patches against the silver-green expanse. Arabella could see the hem of the nightgown trailing dirt and the corner of the folded paper beginning to soften in the dampness. She did not stand. She stayed kneeling, her hands open at her sides, and said quietly, "What is your name?" The child looked at her for a long moment, then passed her to where Julian stood frozen on the gravel. "Sophie," she said, "I drew the house. I counted the windows. Is 63 rooms enough?" Arabella heard Julian take a step forward, heard the crunch of stone beneath his boot, and she turned her head just enough to see him. His face was white, his mouth opened, but no sound came. She looked back at the child and said, "Enough for what, Sophie?" Sophie answered simply, "For me. Harriet said the big house has a different family, but I wanted to see." Arabella felt something crack open inside her chest, something that had been sealed for 3 years. She rose slowly to her feet, her dressing gown heavy with water, and turned to face Julian fully. He was standing 5 paces away, his hands loose at his sides, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. She said nothing. She walked past him toward the house, and after a moment she heard his footsteps follow. Inside, Mrs. Lennox appeared in the corridor with a shawl and a lamp, her eyes wide. 2 footmen stood near the servants' entrance, watching. Arabella took the shawl and wrapped it around Sophie's shoulders, then looked at Mrs. Lennox and said, "Prepare the blue guest room. A fire, hot water, bread and milk if she will take it." Mrs. Lennox hesitated, her gaze flicking to Julian, who stood in the doorway with his coat dripping onto the marble. "Your Grace?" she said uncertainly. Arabella repeated firmly, "The blue room, now." Mrs. Lennox curtsied and disappeared down the corridor. The footman did not move. Arabella turned to Julian and said quietly, "Tell them to go." He nodded once, sharply, and gestured. The footman retreated. The door to the servants' wing closed with a soft click. Arabella looked down at Sophie, who was clutching the folded paper and looking around the entrance hall with wide eyes. She knelt again and said gently, "May I see what you drew?" Sophie handed her the paper. Arabella unfolded it carefully. It was a child's drawing in charcoal. A large house with too many windows, a path leading away from it, and 2 small figures standing in the doorway. One was taller than the other. Arabella's hands did not shake. She folded the paper again and gave it back. "It is a very good drawing," she said. You counted correctly, 63 rooms. Sophie's face brightened. Harriet said I could not count that high, but I can. She acknowledged this. I see that. She stood and held out her hand. Sophie took it. Together they walked toward the staircase, and Julian followed 3 paces behind. The blue guest room had been prepared by the time they reached it. A fire burned in the grate, and Mrs. Lennox had laid out a tray with bread, butter, and a cup of warm milk. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed and ate slowly, her feet swinging above the floor. Arabella sat in the chair by the fire and watched her. Julian stood in the doorway and did not enter. When Sophie had finished eating, she climbed beneath the covers and closed her eyes. Arabella waited until the child's breathing deepened, then rose and walked to the doorway. Julian stepped back into the corridor. She followed him and closed the door softly behind her. They stood facing each other in the dim light of the corridor. Arabella looked at him for a long moment and then said, "She is yours." It was not a question. Julian's jaw tightened and he nodded once. "How old is she?" Arabella asked. He answered quietly, 5. "Where has she been?" "Birch Cottage." Arabella felt the words settle into her chest like stones. "The cottage at the end of the birch path," she said. "The path you told me was dangerous." Julian did not answer. Arabella turned and walked toward their bedchamber. She did not look back to see if he followed. She had visited Dr. Ellis twice in 3 years. The first time had been 6 months into her marriage, when the nursery remained empty and the Dowager had begun making pointed remarks about the Sinclair duty. Dr. Ellis had examined her and told her there was no physical cause for concern. The second visit had been 18 months later, after another winter of silence and another spring of empty rooms. Dr. Ellis had told her the same thing, but his tone had shifted. He had used the word temperamental. He had suggested that some women carried anxieties that interfered with natural processes. He had recommended rest, distraction, and patience. Arabella had believed him. She had believed that her body was failing her, that the emptiness was hers to carry, that the nursery she had prepared in the first month of her marriage would remain a monument to what she could not produce. She had painted the walls herself, a pale cream that caught the morning light. She had sewn the curtains, simple linen with a border of pale blue thread. She had placed a wooden rabbit on the pillow, a gift from her mother before she died. And she had closed the door and not opened it again. She had walked past that door every day for 3 years. And Julian had kissed her goodbye every morning and walked to the birch path where his daughter lived in a cottage 20 minutes from the house. Arabella stood in the bedchamber and looked at the place where he kissed her each dawn. The window faced east, and the first light always touched the foot of the bed before it reached the wardrobe. She had learned to wake to that light, to the sound of Julian dressing, to the ritual of his goodbye. He kissed her forehead first, then her lips, and his hand always rested briefly against her cheek before he stepped back. She had loved those mornings. She had believed they were building something together, something that would one day fill the nursery down the corridor. She turned when she heard his footsteps in the corridor. He entered the room and closed the door behind him. He did not speak. Arabella walked to the wardrobe and opened it, then began removing her traveling trunk from the bottom shelf. Julian spoke her name. She did not look at him. She placed the trunk on the bed and opened it, then began folding a shawl into the bottom. He tried again. "Arabella, please." She looked at him then. He was standing near the door, his coat still damp, his hair disheveled. His hands were loose at his sides, and his face was pale. She said quietly, "I am preparing to leave in the morning. You may say what you need to say. but it will not change that. "Where will you go?" he asked. "To my father's house in Kent." Julian took a step forward. "You do not need to leave." Arabella folded a second shawl and placed it in the trunk. "I do," she said. "I cannot stay in a house where I have been lied to for 3 years by the man who kisses me goodbye every morning." Julian protested. "I did not lie." Arabella stopped folding. She turned to face him fully, her hands still holding the edge of the shawl. "You told me the birch path was dangerous," she said. "You told me this in winter, in spring, in summer, and in autumn. You told me it was treacherous and overgrown and not safe for walking. Was that the truth?" Julian's jaw tightened. He did not answer. "I walked it 2 weeks ago," Arabella said. "It is flat. The ground is firm. There are no roots to trip over, no stones to turn an ankle. It is the safest path on the estate." Julian closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "I did not want you to find the cottage." "Why?" "Because I did not know how to tell you." Arabella set the shawl down on the bed. She walked toward him slowly, her bare feet silent on the carpet. She stopped 2 paces away and said, "You did not know how to tell me that you had a daughter. So instead you lied about a path, and you let me believe that my body was failing me, and you kissed me goodbye every morning and walked to her." He tried to explain. Honest, it was not like that. "Then tell me what it was like." He opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen before, something raw and unguarded, and he said, "I do not know how to say it in a way that will not make it worse." She replied evenly, "Then do not say it." She turned and walked back to the bed. She picked up another shawl and folded it with precise, deliberate movements. "I will leave in the morning. You may tell the Dowager whatever you wish." Julian did not move. Arabella continued packing. After a long moment, she heard him leave the room and close the door softly behind him. Sophie had climbed out of the cottage window just after midnight. She had heard Julian and Harriet arguing in the front room, their voices low but sharp, and then she had pressed her ear to the crack in the door to listen. Harriet had said, "If the Duchess discovers—" and Julian had interrupted her, his voice tight with something Sophie did not understand. "She is a child, not a complication." Sophie had not understood what that meant, but she had understood the tone. She had heard it before, in the weeks after her mother died, when Julian came to the cottage and sat in the chair by the fire and did not speak. Harriet had used that tone then too, careful and measured, as if words were fragile things that might break if spoken too loudly. Sophie had gone back to her room and put on her nightgown. She had taken the drawing she had made of the big house and folded it carefully, then climbed out the window onto the grass below. The walk to the big house had taken longer than she expected. The path was dark, and the trees made shapes against the sky that looked like hands reaching. But she had counted her steps the way Harriet had taught her, and she had not been afraid. When she reached the lawn, she had seen the lights in the windows and the shape of the house rising against the stars. She had counted the windows one by one, touching each number with her finger in the air. And when she reached 63, she had felt something settle inside her chest. Harriet had said the big house had a different family, but Sophie had wanted to see for herself. The woman who found her had knelt in the wet grass without hesitation. She had not grabbed Sophie or scolded her or told her to go back. She had asked if Sophie was lost, and Sophie had told her the truth. She was not lost. She had come to see. Now Sophie lay in a bed that smelled like lavender and clean linen, and she listened to the sound of voices in the corridor outside. She could not hear the words, but she could hear the tone. The woman's voice was steady and low. The man's voice was rough and broken. Sophie closed her eyes and thought of the drawing folded beneath her pillow, and she wondered if 63 rooms was enough. Morning came slowly. Arabella woke to the sound of the door opening and turned to see Julian standing in the doorway, already dressed. He looked as though he had not slept. His collar was crooked, and there were shadows beneath his eyes. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and Arabella sat up and pulled the blanket around her shoulders. He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then her lips, playing the same ritual they had shared every morning for 3 years. His hand rested against her cheek, and she felt the warmth of his palm and the faint roughness of his fingers. He straightened, and she looked up at him and said quietly, "Say goodbye to her for me too." Julian froze. His hand dropped from her face. He stared at her, his expression unreadable, and then he turned and walked out of the room without a word. Arabella sat in the silence and listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. She rose and dressed, her hands steady, and then she went to the blue guest room to check on Sophie. The child was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with the drawing unfolded on her lap. She looked up when Arabella entered and said, "Is he coming back?" Arabella sat beside her and answered honestly, "I do not know." Sophie nodded slowly, and as if this was an answer she had expected. She folded the drawing again and held it against her chest. "Harriet says he always comes back." "Who is Harriet?" Arabella asked gently. "She takes care of me," Sophie said. "At the cottage. She makes bread and teaches me letters and tells me stories." Arabella felt her throat constrict. She reached out and smoothed a strand of hair away from Sophie's face. "Would you like some breakfast?" she asked. Sophie nodded. Arabella took her hand and led her downstairs to the kitchen. Mrs. Lennox was already there, rolling dough on the long wooden table. She looked up when Arabella and Sophie entered, her expression carefully neutral. Arabella said, "Sophie will take breakfast here this morning. Bread and butter, jam if we have it, and milk." Mrs. Lennox curtsied. "Yes, your grace." Arabella sat at the table with Sophie and watched as Mrs. Lennox prepared the meal. The kitchen smelled of yeast and wood smoke, and the morning light came through the high windows in pale slants. Sophie ate slowly, her feet swinging beneath the chair, and Arabella sat beside her and did not speak. When Sophie had finished, Arabella took her upstairs to the blue room and helped her wash her face and hands. She found a simple dress in the wardrobe, one that had belonged to a cousin's child and had been left behind years ago, and she helped Sophie into it. The dress was slightly too large, but Sophie did not seem to mind. She looked at herself in the mirror and said, "It is very clean." Arabella knelt beside her and said, "Sophie, I need to ask you something. Do you know who I am?" Sophie nodded. "You are the Duchess. You live in the big house. Do you know who the man is? The one who was here last night?" Sophie's face brightened. "That is Julian. He comes to visit me at the cottage. He brings me books and tells me about the horses." Arabella felt her chest tighten again. She said carefully, "Does he tell you why he cannot bring you here, to the big house?" Sophie's smile faded. She looked down at her hands and said quietly, "Harriet says the big house has a different family. She says I have to stay at the cottage because that is where I belong." Arabella reached out and took Sophie's hands in hers. "You belong wherever you are safe and cared for," she said, "and I would like you to stay here. Would that be all right with you?" Sophie looked up at her, her dark eyes wide. "In the big house, with 63 rooms?" She confirmed it. "Yes, and in the big house." Sophie nodded slowly, and then she smiled. It was a small smile, hesitant and uncertain, but it was real. Arabella stood and held out her hand, and Sophie took it. Julian found Arabella in the corridor outside the blue room an hour later. He looked as though he had been walking for some time. His coat was damp with morning dew, and there were bits of grass clinging to his boots. He stopped when he saw her and said, "Where is she?" "In the kitchen with Mrs. Lennox," Arabella said, "eating a second breakfast." Julian nodded. He did not move. Arabella looked at him and said, "She is yours." He acknowledged it quietly. "Yes." "How long have you known?" "Since the day she was born." Arabella felt the words settle into her chest like stones. She said quietly, "And you chose not to tell me." He repeated simply, "Mosh, yes." Arabella turned to face him fully. She said, "I want you to understand something. I am not angry because you have a daughter. I am angry because you lied to me. You lied to my doctor. You lied about the path. You lied every morning when you kissed me goodbye and walked to her. And you let me believe that the emptiness was mine to carry." Julian's jaw tightened. He said, "I did not know how to tell you." "That is not an answer," Arabella said. "That is an excuse." She walked past him toward the staircase, and after a moment she heard his footsteps follow. The estate office was on the ground floor, a small room lined with shelves and filled with the scent of leather and ink. Arabella entered and sat in the chair behind the desk. Julian followed and stood near the door, his hands loose at his sides, and Arabella looked at him and said, "Tell me every lie." Julian closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. He said, "I wrote to Dr. Ellis before your first visit. I told him that your concern about childlessness was temperamental. I asked him to redirect your inquiry." Arabella felt her breath catch. She said, "You wrote to my doctor?" He confirmed it. "Yes." "You told him to lie to me?" "I told him to reassure you," Julian said. "I did not think—" "You did not think I deserved to know the truth," Arabella said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the desk. "What else?" "I lied about the birch path," Julian said. "I told you it was dangerous, so you would not walk it. I told you this every season for 3 years. She pressed him. "What else?" Julian hesitated. He looked at her with an expression that was almost pleading, and then he said, "I instructed Harriet to tell Sophie that the big house has a different family. I told her to explain that Sophie could not come here because she did not belong." Arabella stood. She walked around the desk and stopped 2 paces away from him. She said quietly, "You told a 5-year-old child that she did not belong in her own father's house." He admitted it. "Yes." "Were you relieved?" Arabella asked. "When you made those choices? When you wrote to Dr. Ellis and lied about the path and told Harriet to keep Sophie away? Were you relieved?" Julian's face went pale. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Finally, he said, "Yes." Arabella felt a cold understanding wash through her, sharp and clarifying. She said, "Sophie is in the kitchen. You are going to stand here and decide whether you are the man who wrote to Dr. Ellis or someone else. And then you are going to walk through that door and face her." She turned and left the office. Julian did not follow. Sophie was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of milk and a slice of bread when Arabella returned. Mrs. Lennox was kneading dough at the far end of the table, her hands moving in steady, practiced rhythms. Sophie looked up when Arabella entered and said, "Mrs. Lennox says there is a garden, with herbs. May I see it?" Arabella sat beside her and said, "Yes, after you finish your milk." Sophie drank quickly, then set the cup down and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Arabella smiled and handed her a napkin. "Like this," she said gently, and Sophie took the napkin and wiped her mouth again, more carefully this time. They walked to the kitchen garden together, through the corridor and out the side door into the morning light. The garden was small, bordered by low stone walls, and filled with rows of rosemary, thyme, and lavender. Sophie knelt beside the lavender and touched the flowers carefully, her fingers brushing the purple blooms. "It smells like Harriet," she said. Arabella knelt beside her and said, "Harriet grows lavender?" Sophie nodded. "In the pots by the cottage door. She makes sachets. She says they help with sleep." Arabella felt her chest tighten. She reached out and broke off a sprig of lavender, then held it to her nose. It was the same scent she had smelled on Julian's collar every morning for 3 years. Sharp, wild, with a note of resin underneath. She handed the sprig to Sophie and said, "Mas, you may keep it if you like." Sophie took the sprig and held it carefully, as if it were something precious. She said, "Are you the family?" Arabella looked at her, at the small face framed by dark hair, at the hands holding the lavender sprig with such care. She said quietly, "I am, if you will have me." Sophie nodded slowly, and then she smiled. The Dowager Duchess learned of Sophie's presence from Mrs. Lennox, who had been instructed to maintain staff silence, but who could not resist the temptation to confide in the housekeeper at the Dower House. By midday, Lady Margaret Devereux had arrived at the estate in her carriage, her face set in an expression of cold fury. She found Julian in the drawing room and closed the door behind her. She did not sit. She stood near the fireplace and said, "I have been informed that a child was found on the lawn last night, a child who was brought inside and given a room." Julian looked at her and confirmed it. "You will return her to Birch Cottage immediately," Margaret said. "This arrangement was made for a reason. The child is cared for. She is safe. She does not belong in this house." Julian stood. He said quietly, "She is my daughter." "She is the result of a mistake," Margaret said. "A mistake that was managed with discretion and care. You will not undo 3 years of careful planning because the child climbed out a window." He stated firmly, "She is not going back." Margaret's expression did not change. She said, "I will write to Lord Wentworth. I will inform him that you have violated the terms of the settlement by bringing a child of questionable origin into the household. I will give you 3 days to resolve this matter before I send the letter." Julian's jaw tightened. He said, "You may write whatever you wish. She is not going back." Margaret turned and left the room. Julian stood alone in the drawing room and then listened to the sound of her carriage pulling away. He found Arabella in the corridor outside the nursery. She was standing with her hand on the door, her expression distant. He said, "My mother has written to your father." Arabella turned to face him. She said, "What did she write?" "She will frame Sophie's presence as a settlement violation," Julian said. "She will demand that Sophie be returned to the cottage. She has given me 3 days." Arabella looked at him for a long moment, then said, "She is not going back." Julian felt something shift inside his chest. He said, "Jan, you do not have to do this." She replied with certainty, "Yes, I do." She turned and walked down the corridor, and Julian followed. 2 days passed. Sophie woke screaming on the first night, calling for Harriet in a voice that was raw and desperate. Arabella heard her from the corridor and entered the blue room to find Sophie sitting up in bed, her face wet with tears. Arabella stopped in the doorway and did not approach. She said quietly, "I am here, Sophie. You are safe." Sophie looked at her, her chest heaving, and then she said, "I want Harriet." Arabella acknowledged this gently. "I know. Would you like me to sit with you?" Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Arabella crossed the room and sat in the chair by the fire. She did not try to touch Sophie or move closer. She simply sat and waited. And after a long moment, Sophie lay back down and closed her eyes. On the second day, Arabella took Sophie to the kitchen garden again. She showed her how to identify rosemary by the shape of the leaves, thyme by the scent, and lavender by the color of the blooms. Sophie listened carefully, her small hands touching each plant as Arabella named it. Julian watched from the garden gate, but did not enter. Harriet found him standing there and said, "Walk through it." Julian turned to look at her. Harriet was a tall woman with gray hair and a steady gaze. She had cared for Sophie since the day Catherine died, and she had never once asked Julian for more than what was necessary. Now she looked at him and said, "You cannot stand outside forever. Walk through the gate." Julian opened the gate and crossed the garden. He knelt beside Sophie in the herb bed, and Arabella looked at him without speaking. She reached out and adjusted his grip on a rosemary stem, her hand over his, correcting the pressure. She held the position for 3 seconds past instruction, her fingers warm against his skin, and then she released him and stepped back. She made physical room for him beside Sophie, but her expression did not grant permission. She turned and walked back to the house, leaving Julian kneeling in the herb bed with his daughter. That evening, Julian drafted a letter to Dr. Ellis. He sat at the estate desk and wrote in careful, deliberate script. "Dr. Ellis, 3 years ago, I wrote to you regarding my wife's concern about childlessness. I instructed you to redirect her inquiry and to frame her concern as temperamental. And I did this to conceal the existence of my daughter, who was living on the estate at Birch Cottage. I am writing now to confess that I misrepresented my wife's condition. The harm was my choice. I ask nothing of you except that you understand the full scope of what I did. Julian Devereux, Duke of Ashmore." He folded the letter and brought it to Arabella in the morning room. She was sitting by the window with a book in her lap, though she did not appear to be reading. He placed the letter on the table between them and said, "I wrote to Dr. Ellis." Arabella picked up the letter and read it without speaking. When she finished, she placed it back on the table and looked at him. She did not say it was enough. She did not say anything at all. Julian stood for a moment, then turned and left the room. The Dowager prepared the estate drawing room for Lord Wentworth's arrival. She instructed Mrs. Lennox to ensure that the staff remained silent and that no evidence of Sophie's presence was visible. Mrs. Lennox nodded and curtsied, but her hands were shaking as she left the room. Sophie found Arabella in the morning room, climbed onto the chair beside her. She said, "Why can I not go to the nursery wing?" Arabella took her hand and said, "Soon." "When is soon?" Sophie asked. Arabella looked at her, at the small face turned up toward hers, and she said, "I do not know yet, but I promise you, it will be soon." Sophie nodded and leaned against Arabella's shoulder. Arabella put her arm around the child and held her close, and they sat together in the morning light. Lord Wentworth arrived on the 3rd day, for he was a tall man with gray hair and a stern expression, and he entered the estate drawing room with the air of a man who had traveled a long distance and had no patience for delays. The Dowager rose to greet him, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She said, Lord Wentworth, thank you for coming." Wentworth nodded curtly. He said, "Your letter was quite clear, Lady Margaret. You claim that my son-in-law has violated the terms of the settlement. He has brought a child of questionable origin into the household," Margaret said. "A child who has been living at Birch Cottage for 5 years. The arrangement was made to protect the family's reputation and to preserve the alliance between our houses. By bringing the child into the main house, he has placed both at risk." Wentworth looked at Julian, who was standing near the fireplace, and he said, "Is this true?" Julian stepped forward. He said, "Yes, I have a daughter. Her name is Sophie. She is 5 years old. She has been living at Birch Cottage since the day she was born. Wentworth's expression did not change. He said, "Why was I not informed of this?" "Because I was ashamed," Julian said. "Because I did not know how to explain that my first wife died in childbirth, and that I could not bear to bring the child into the house. Because I chose to hide her rather than face what I had done." Wentworth looked at him for a long moment, then said, "And now?" Julian took a breath. He said, "I lied to Arabella. I wrote to her doctor and told him to redirect her medical inquiry. I told her the birch path was dangerous, so she would not find the cottage. I instructed Harriet to tell Sophie that the big house has a different family. I did these things deliberately, and I did them for 3 years." The door to the drawing room opened, and Arabella entered. She did not wait to be acknowledged. She walked to the center of the room and said, "My husband interfered with my medical care. He lied to me about the safety of a path on my own estate. He told a child that she did not belong in her father's house. These are the facts." Wentworth looked at her, and his expression softened slightly. He said, "What do you wish to do, Arabella?" Arabella looked at the Dowager, then at Julian, then back at her father. She said, "I wish to raise Sophie in this house. I wish for her to have the nursery that has been waiting for 3 years. I wish for my husband to decide whether he is the man who wrote to Dr. Ellis or someone else." Wentworth nodded slowly. He turned to the Dowager and said, "My daughter's husband interfered with her medical care. That is not a settlement violation. That is a betrayal of trust. The family's reputation rests on the decision of the woman your son deceived, not on your definition of propriety." The Dowager's face went pale. She said, "Lord Wentworth, I must insist." "You may insist all you like," Wentworth said, "but I will support whatever choice my daughter makes, and I suggest you do the same." He turned and left the room. The Dowager stood in silence for a long moment, then walked to the door and left without another word. Arabella turned to Julian and said, "Come with me." She led him upstairs to the nursery. The door had been closed for 3 years, and when Arabella opened it, the room smelled faintly of dust and lavender. The walls were painted a pale cream, and the curtains were simple linen with a border of pale blue thread. On the bed was a wooden rabbit, worn smooth with age. Arabella stood in the center of the room and said, "I prepared this room 3 years ago. I painted the walls. I sewed the curtains. I placed the rabbit on the pillow, and I waited." Julian stood in the doorway and began to speak. "My father told me I was never what was required," Arabella said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "And then the nursery stayed empty, and I thought he was right. I thought my body was failing me. I thought the emptiness was mine to carry." Julian crossed the room and stood in front of her. He said, "I am sorry." "That is not enough," Arabella said. "Sorry is what you say when you forget a name or arrive late to dinner. This is not that." Julian's jaw tightened. He said, "I know." The door opened, and Sophie appeared in the doorway, holding Harriet's hand. She looked around the room with wide eyes and said, "Is this my room?" Arabella turned to face her. She said, "It has been waiting 3 years." Sophie let go of Harriet's hand and walked to the bed. She picked up the wooden rabbit and held it carefully, her fingers tracing the smooth ears. She said, "What is his name?" "He does not have one yet," Arabella said. "Would you like to give him one?" Sophie thought for a moment, then said, "Birch." Arabella smiled. She said, "That is a very good name." Julian sat on the floor, his back against the wall, and his hands loose at his side. His body seemed to collapse inward, as if standing required a dignity he no longer had. Arabella looked at him, then knelt beside him. She reached out and placed her hand against his sternum, her palm flat against his chest. She said, "That is not forgiveness. That is evidence I survived what you did." Julian looked at her, his eyes red. He said, "What do you need from me?" "I need you here every morning," Arabella said. "Not on the path, not at the cottage. Here, with her, with me." Julian leaned forward, his forehead resting against hers. Arabella closed her eyes and felt the warmth of his breath against her skin. She tilted her head and kissed him, slow and deliberate, her hand still pressed against his chest. When she pulled back, she said, "That is not forgiveness either, and that is a beginning." Winter came slowly to the estate. The mornings grew cold, and frost covered the lawns in silver patterns. Julian woke in the ducal bedchamber and dressed quietly, and then he leaned down and kissed Arabella goodbye. But he did not leave. He sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Sophie once colored pencils. She says horses have more legs than 7 colors can show." Arabella smiled and said, "Then we will get her more colors." Across the corridor, Sophie sat in the nursery and narrated a story to Birch the rabbit. Her voice was clear and steady, and the words tumbled out in a stream of imagination and wonder. Arabella stood in the doorway and listened, and Julian stood beside her. Spring arrived with pale green leaves and the scent of lavender on the morning air, and the three of them walked the birch path together, Sophie between them, one hand in each of theirs. Sophie said, "The path is shorter with 3. Arabella looked at Julian, and he looked back at her. She said, "Yes, it is." The nursery walls had been repainted pale green, the color of the birch leaves when the sun came through. Birch the rabbit sat on the pillow, and the curtains moved gently in the morning breeze. On the estate desk, framed in simple wood, was Julian's letter to Dr. Ellis. The words were clear and deliberate. "I misrepresented my wife's condition. The harm was my choice." Arabella stood at the window and looked out at the garden. Julian came to stand beside her, and Sophie ran in from the corridor with a drawing in her hand. She held it up and said, "I drew us, all 3. Arabella took the drawing and looked at it. The 3 figures standing on a path, holding hands. She knelt and said, "It is beautiful, Sophie." Sophie smiled and ran back to the nursery. Julian put his arm around Arabella's shoulders, and she leaned into him. They stood together in the morning light, and for the first time in 3 years, the house felt whole.